Hi, I'm Lindsey O'Donnell-Welch, Executive Editor with Decipher, and I'm here today at Black Hat with Wendy Nather, who is the Director of Strategic Engagement with Cisco. Wendy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a really cool suite.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and it's nice to see people in person. So,
Yeah.
So you're on the advisory board for the CISO summit that happened this week during Black Hat, and would love to hear a little bit about the summit and some of the big topics and challenges that were discussed by CISOs.
What we do when we're planning the summit, when we're planning the content, is we try to figure out what CISOs really most want to hear this year. So there's a lot of discussion about what's trending, what's not, what's important, and what, who we should reach out to speak on these topics. Because part of the problem is obviously CISOs don't want to be pitched to in the middle of this summit. So we have to find people who are going to talk about the subjects themselves, but not with an agenda of any kind. One of the things we've played around with this year was topics that are distracting CISOs. In other words, if you're a CISO, you usually have a plan in place, a program, and it's multi-year, and there are things you're trying to get done. And then there are the events or topics or trends that distract you from that just kind of derail you. So one, obviously was the pandemic, and still is. That really knocked a hole in a lot of people's regular security programs. Another distraction is AI, and I know we're going to talk about that. All of a sudden, everybody has to answer the question of what is it, what can we use it for, how do we secure it? Things like supply chain security are still distractions in that, or areas that you now have to build into your program that you didn't have to before. And even personal things like personal liability for CISOs as a topic. And breaches, of course. Those always derail you when you suddenly realize you have to get something done.
Mm-hmm. And to those latter 2 points, like the things like the SEC cyber rules and those types of things are really kind of making the conversation continue around those areas.
It is. I mean, you can look at things like cyber regulations as regular compliance, and okay, these things are adjusting, they're being tweaked, we're going to have to respond to them. But then there are things like really large breaches. For example, Chris Hoff came and talked to us about the LastPass breach. And it was Chatham House rules, so I can't really say everything that he said, but we learned a lot about the ins and outs and why it took so long for them to be able to release the information that they did have. It took them a long time to get it. So those sorts of things where you suddenly lose your entire agenda as a CISO and have to go, right, we're going to have to rebuild everything from the ground up. To
your first point, coronavirus, that was a major wrench, I'm sure, in a lot of plans. But how are you seeing that now that we're 4 years out, but obviously such big impacts that I'm sure the dust is still settling. What was kind of the discussions like in that area? It
was a lot like, okay, suddenly everybody had to go home and we had to accommodate them. And I know around 2020, we saw a lot of organizations not being able to get the supplies that they needed, not being able to issue laptops to everybody. Yes, they had remote access, but not for everybody in the building. And so they ended up saying, just go home and use whatever you have and we'll figure it out later. So now it's later, and now everybody's trying to figure out, okay, who has what? Is it really as secure as we need it to be for remote access? And the other thing that's really interesting is every so often now, people are being called back into the office in large numbers, maybe for an all hands. And so all the network traffic moves. Suddenly everybody is back in the building and they have to deal with it there, and then they all go home again. So balancing that and being able to adapt for the users so they don't have to do completely different things depending on where they are, and managing that network traffic wherever it happens to be is the challenge that's still going on.
Right, and it's so many variations too, like you could be fully remote or hybrid or just fully back in the office, and I think we are in that transition time where companies are, beckoning employees back into the office, so.
We are, and it's kind of like everybody running to one side of the boat and it tilts, and then they all run to the other side of the boat, and that's a dynamic that we didn't have before.
Right, right. Well, I also wanted to cover AI.
Okay, wait, don't hang up.
Yeah. The big AI word.
Yeah.
So what were the discussions around that? Because that was something that has been widely discussed, but I think there is also a little bit of what's the realistic applications here and how does that impact security teams?
We had some good presentations on that, and I've also been talking to analysts and data scientists and other people and saying, well, what does it mean to you? Because there are a lot of CISOs who just kind of go, they just cringe when you say AI. And in fact, one of the speakers that we had mentioned that it's now a trend apparently in Silicon Valley where they set up a room in the office building where you're not allowed to say AI. And so everybody's running in for that. The questions are, what is it really? What are the limitations? What are we reading into it? And is it useful? I had a really interesting conversation with Dave Maynor, who's a really well-known security researcher. And he's one of the people who actually came forward and said, I am building my own Gen AI agents right now to go out and do things for me in my research that people used to do for me when I was at the NSA. And he said, if I can get these agents working for me, I may be able to extend my professional life by about 20 years, extend my useful life, the work I'm able to do by building these things. And I thought that was really cool.
That sounds fascinating. In terms of the security risks around AI, what do the conversations around that look like? Here at Black Hat, there's a lot of conversations around the security risks of LLMs themselves, but I'd imagine for CISOs, it's more of a matter of data governance, privacy, keeping data safe. So what kind of thoughts did people have in that area?
Well, it's absolutely data governance, as you said, and part of that is because the data that we're talking about now is not just the character strings and stopping them from going in and going out and doing regexes and pattern matching. It is looking at the information above that, what that represents, what the context is. You have to watch for somebody tricking your chatbot into saying, yes, I will sell you this car for $1. That's the sort of level of information that we haven't tried to deal with. A lot of this is automation and automation at scale, and we've had this for a long time, and we know what's needed for automation. We need transparency and consistency. We need it to be tightly scoped. We need to know exactly what it's going to do. So that leads to the other problem with AI, which is that it's non-deterministic. You may give it the same input twice, and you won't get the same output back again. So on the one hand, we can't be absolutely sure, of the whole universe of possibilities of what output something is going to give you. That non-deterministic quality is something we have to figure out how to manage. But on the other hand, it's pretty cool that if there are attackers who are trying to elicit a particular output, you could watch that from an intrusion detection standpoint and see if somebody is sending the same prompts over and over again and trying to tweak them, they're obviously trying to elicit something in particular. What is it? That sort of level of intrusion detection is going to be really interesting. And then finally, the business has to decide what decisions are we going to enable based on the outputs of this AI. And it is not just, if we get this string, we're going to do this. We still, as humans, have to bring our experience into it, our emotions even, and these are inputs that cannot go into AI. We just can't do that part. So there's a lot more that CISOs have to drag the business into and saying, look, it's entirely possible that what we are using this for is going to come out with something that we didn't expect and we have to deal with. That aspect to it is almost like having another human in the loop that you didn't necessarily hire for that role, but there they are mixing and matching and messing things up potentially.
How does that fit into the broader security strategy that a CISO might have? Like, how can they be proactive about approaching that type of situation? Is that something that people are still even thinking about, or is that kind of a non-issue, or what are you seeing there?
They are thinking about it because they are being dragged into discussions with their management who want to know, what is this AI stuff? Should we be using it? Or our suppliers are now using AI, and is this an issue for us? And yes, it is, to the extent that third-party suppliers and providers that we're used to working with are suddenly asking to be able to use our corporate data that we are storing and manipulating with them, using it for their own purposes in ways that we'd never thought of before. I have a friend who is just in the process of getting a book published, and all of a sudden the publishing house changed the terms of the contract and said, okay, we can now use everything that's in your book to train our AI. And he's trying to get out of it because terms of use of corporate data are suddenly shifting.
Well, that dovetails nicely with something else I wanted to ask about, which you mentioned supply chain, software supply chain, third-party risk. How are CISOs approaching these types of situations in their own environments?
It's pretty fractured right now, is what I'm hearing from other CISOs, that a lot of the vulnerability management strategy that we have is kind of centered around what tools we have. So if you have a hammer, you're just going to be nailing a lot of nails for vulnerability management, even if you have screws in your environment. If you have a hybrid environment, we really need to start thinking about not just centering it with the tools we have, but looking at the gaps in between. What other types of vulnerability do we have to manage with and without our provider? So that was a really interesting point that somebody made.
I feel like the software supply chain has been a big issue, but just for me, watching one thing happening and kind of the cascading impact downstream is always interesting to see how that plays out. And I'd imagine it's slightly concerning to have something like that a little bit out of your control, and you can really only do what you can in your own environment to try to vet and better understand like how you can get a grasp of those types of situations really from a CISO perspective.
When you go to a third-party supplier, you save on cost, but then you lose commensurately in control. And so you have to figure out whether you're okay with that. And the forms in which that loss of control can take are now changing, as I mentioned, because nobody assumed 5 years ago that anybody would be using the data you stored in a SaaS for anything outside of your control, and now we have to think about it. So a lot of this comes back to the relationship you have with your provider. Can you talk with them about it, or are they trying to change the terms out from under you without consulting you?
All right, well, lastly, you did mention liability, and CISO liability has been a big topic of conversation over the past years. Do you see conversations around liability shifting at all? There's a lot of talk around kind of board of directors trying to bring the responsibility of security up to that level by having more security experts on the board of directors. Or on the flip side, you see other things like CISOs taking the blame for some of the high-profile incidents that we see. So where are we in between those two things, two factors, I guess, that are pulling the thread on CISO liability?
Well, everybody's really interested in that from a CISO point of view, especially since, as always, and even more these days, CISOs are moving around. And there's a big area of discussion on, well, what should you be looking for or asking for when you're going to take a new position as a CISO? The Team 8 Village group came out with a really interesting ebook about what sort of things you should be looking for from a regulatory standpoint, what kind of liability issues should you worry about as a CISO, and then therefore also what should you be building into your next employment contract when you're taking another position. So that is really useful. There are other things that are like personal risks that CISOs are facing that they haven't had to before. I was talking to one CISO at the summit who got a phone call, well, his wife got a phone call on her phone, which was not associated with his, but it was a security vendor salesperson trying to reach him. And he was really enraged about that. He said, that is over the line,
Right.
Targeting his family to try to get to him for a sales call.
No.
And
Yeah.
he got an apology from the CEO, but he was still really, really sour about that. I have another friend who was swatted, and because of some of the work that he was doing, And so those sorts of personal risks are coming to the fore for CISOs today too.
And not to mention burnout and a lot of these issues that impact your personal life too, that stem from the job itself. That's a whole other topic that we could talk about for an hour. Well, Wendy, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today, and it's great seeing you here at Black Hat.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.
Great, thank you.